The radio crackled with static, then silence. Command centers across 3 time zones held their breath as the secure channel that had carried Sergeant Matthews' voice for the past 6 hours went dead. Somewhere in the Kunar Valley, 8 Marine SEALs had vanished into the kind of silence that makes generals age overnight. The last transmission had been fragmentary, urgent, professional even as the world collapsed around them. Heavy contact. Grid November Quebec 7345. Ammunition critical. We're then nothing. The kind of nothing that fills situation rooms with the weight of decisions that will be scrutinized for decades. The kind of nothing that makes colonels reach for phones they don't want to pick up, to make calls they've rehearsed in nightmares. Within minutes, the Joint Operations Center at Bagram had cycled through every available asset. Satellites repositioned, their lenses searching for heat signatures among endless ridges. Drones redirected, their cameras scanning terrain that had swallowed armies for centuries. Apache gunships spooled up, their pilots pulling on helmets with hands that moved through pre-flight checks on muscle memory alone. But the valley was a cauldron of weather, a geographical trap where mountains created their own climate. Clouds sat heavy at 8,000 feet, turning the world below into guesswork and prayer. The Apache couldn't descend through that ceiling without instruments screaming warnings. The drones saw nothing but gray static. The satellites measured heat through layers of atmosphere that might as well have been concrete. And on the ground, 8 men were counting bullets, calculating angles, making the kind of mathematical decisions where every number represented one more second of breath. Captain Rodriguez stood in the operations center, his jaw tight as he studied topographical maps that had been measured in blood over 2 decades of war. The valley was a kill box, a natural amphitheater where defenders held every advantage. Elevation, concealment, intimate knowledge of terrain that didn't appear on any map. His teams had walked those ridges, had learned to read the landscape like a language, but reading it from above and surviving it from within were entirely different translations. "We need eyes down there," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from accepting impossibility as a starting point rather than an obstacle. "We need someone who can get under that ceiling, someone who can see what we can't." Across the room, a young lieutenant reached for a different frequency, one that didn't appear on standard tactical channels. Her hand hesitated over the switch, professional doubt warring with operational desperation. The call sign she was about to use belonged to a pilot most of the command structure had written off years ago, a relic from a different kind of war, flying an aircraft that had survived more through bureaucratic inertia than strategic relevance. But desperation has its own clarity, its own mathematics. Sometimes the only answer is the one nobody wants to hear. She keyed the microphone. "Hog 2-1, this is Bagram Actual. We have a situation." The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the apron at Forward Operating Base Chapman like a predator carved from titanium and bad intentions. Even motionless, the aircraft carried the aesthetic of controlled violence, its twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, its nose built around a cannon that had been designed before the aircraft itself. The GAU-8 Avenger was the heart of the machine, 7 barrels capable of firing depleted uranium shells at a rate that turned air into thunder and targets into memory. Everything else about the plane was built to serve that gun, to get it into position, and keep it there while the world tried very hard to bring it down. Paint worn pale by sun and sand covered the airframe, patches and rivets marking repairs from missions that had tested the aircraft's legendary durability. The titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit showed scorch marks that maintenance crews had long since stopped trying to polish away. This wasn't a showpiece. It was a tool, maintained with the kind of meticulous care that mechanics reserve for equipment they trust with lives that matter. In the cockpit, Captain Alina Voss ran through her pre-flight check with movements that had been carved into muscle memory through 5,000 hours and 3 combat deployments. Her hands moved across switches and dials without conscious thought, each touch confirming systems that she knew by feel as much as by instrument reading. Radio checks, hydraulic pressure, ammunition count, fuel load. the litany of verification that stood between takeoff and catastrophe. She was 34, compact and watertight, her flight suit worn soft at the elbows and knees. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that had survived more G-forces than most pilots would experience in a career. No makeup, no jewelry except for dog tags that rested against her sternum, with the weight of identity distilled to stamped metal. Her call sign Reaper 6 was stenciled below the canopy rail in letters that had faded from white to gray. It was a name she'd earned in Helmand Province, flying low and slow while the world turned into tracers and smoke. A name that had once carried weight in ready rooms and tactical briefings. That had been 4 years ago, before the evaluation, before the grounding, before the official report that had questioned her judgment in language designed to end careers without quite saying so directly. She'd kept flying, but the missions had changed. Training runs, equipment tests, photo reconnaissance when satellites couldn't get the angle. The kind of assignments that kept pilots technically current while ensuring they never came close to the sharp edge of combat. Her wingmen now were fresh lieutenants learning to spell CAS, treating her like a museum piece that could still taxi, but shouldn't be trusted with ammunition that mattered. She'd learned to accept it, to find satisfaction in teaching even as something vital slowly calcified in her chest. Until the radio brought a voice she hadn't heard in months, urgent with the kind of need that cuts through bureaucracy like cannon fire through armor. Reaper 6, we have 8 souls on the ground, no communication, heavy contact reported before loss of signal. Weather has everything grounded except you. We need low-level reconnaissance, immediate tasking. Alina's hand paused over the throttle. Through the canopy, she could see the operations officer sprinting across the tarmac, tablet in hand, his face carrying the expression of a man delivering orders he knew would be questioned. Behind him, ground crew were already moving, their practiced choreography suggesting this wasn't a request that allowed for deliberation. She keyed the radio, her voice carrying none of the emotion currently rearranging her tactical assessment. Copy that, Bagram, requesting grid coordinates and last known position. The data came through in a burst transmission, numbers that translated into terrain she knew from maps and mission briefs but had never flown in anger. The Kunar Valley, where helicopters went approved the limitations of rotor-wing aviation and fixed-wing aircraft, came back with stories that sounded like fiction until you saw the battle damage, where the mountains created weather systems that meteorologists studied and pilots avoided. Weather ceiling is at 8,000 feet, visibility less than a quarter mile below that. You'll be flying instruments until you're practically touching the rocks. Alina was already running calculations, her mind shifting into the kind of tactical geometry that had kept her alive when newer pilots were still learning to read their heads-up displays. The A-10 could fly low, could maintain controlled flight at speeds that would stall anything designed after 1980, could put ordnance on target in weather that grounded everything with a turbine and a career to protect. "What's the opposition estimate?" she asked, knowing the answer would be incomplete, knowing that incomplete information was the only kind that mattered in the valley. "Unknown. We lost contact during engagement. Could be squad-sized element, could be reinforced company. Terrain suggests prepared positions." In other words, she'd be flying into a situation where every ridge could hide a machine gun, where every shepherd trail might terminate in a DSHK heavy weapon that could turn an aircraft into aluminum confetti, where the only thing certain was that 8 Marines were counting on someone being willing to accept those odds. The operations officer reached her aircraft, breathing hard, his tablet showing mission parameters that updated even as she reviewed them. His eyes met hers through the canopy with an expression that mixed hope and doubt in equal measure. "Captain, if there's anyone who can get eyes on those Marines, it's you. But I need to be clear, this is voluntary. The weather alone makes this outside normal operational parameters." Alina looked past him to the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks lost in cloud that looked solid enough to climb. Somewhere under that ceiling, 8 men were learning exactly how long a second could last when measured in the intervals between heartbeats. She'd been one of those people once, had felt the particular clarity that comes when the world narrows to the next piece of cover, the next magazine, the next breath that might be the last one you take without thinking about it. "Pre-flight complete," she said, her hand already moving to close the canopy. "I'll be wheels up in 3 minutes." The operations officer nodded, relief and concern fighting for control of his expression. "Good hunting, Reaper. Bring them home." The canopy locked with a hydraulic hiss that sealed her into the cockpit's familiar cocoon. Through the transparency, the world took on the quality of a movie she was watching from inside the screen. Ground crew pulled chocks, their hand signals precise even as their faces showed the strain of sending someone into weather that had grounded pilots with twice her flight hours. Alina advanced the throttles, feeling the twin General Electric turbofans wind up with a sound like controlled fury. The A-10 wasn't fast, wasn't elegant, wasn't designed to inspire poetry about the beauty of flight. It was designed to survive, to keep flying when everything from the wings to the tail had been shot to pieces, to get pilots home even when the mission had gone sideways in ways that defied prediction. As she taxied toward the runway, she caught sight of her reflection in the canopy glass, distorted by curvature and scratches that marked near misses from missions she didn't discuss. The woman looking back at her carried the kind of calm that comes from accepting that some decisions can't be calculated, only executed. That sometimes the only choice is between the risk of action and the certainty of regret. The tower cleared her for immediate departure, their usual protocols abbreviated to recognition that time was a resource being spent with every passing second. Reaper 6, winds are 310 at 15, gusting to 25. Cleared for takeoff, runway 27. She rolled onto the runway without pause, her hands and feet moving through the takeoff sequence while her mind was already in the valley, already mapping angles and approaches for terrain she'd studied but never flown. The throttles went a full power, the engine's roar vibrating through the airframe with the deep-throated authority that made the A-10 sound like it was daring gravity to try something. Acceleration pressed her back into the seat, the runway centerline blurring as airspeed climbed through the numbers that mattered. 80 knots, 100, 120. The nose lifted, the world tilted, and then she was airborne, climbing into a sky that looked nothing like the weather briefings suggested. Below, the operations officer watched her aircraft bank toward the mountains, its silhouette unmistakable even at distance. Ungainly on the ground, brutal in the air, the A-10 flew like it was looking for a fight it knew it would win through sheer refusal to quit. He keyed his radio to the command frequency. Bagram Actual, Reaper 6 is airborne and proceeding to tasking. ETA to target area 12 minutes. In the operations center, Captain Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission and turned back to maps that showed topography, but couldn't capture the reality of what Alina was flying into. The mountains rose ahead like a wall built by gods who didn't want visitors. Alina descended, watching her altimeter unspool as she dropped toward the cloud deck that marked the boundary between instrument flight and the kind of visual navigation that required trusting your eyes more than your gauges. At 8,000 feet, she entered the gray. The world outside the canopy became formless, a universe of moisture and reduced visibility that turned flying into an exercise in faith. She watched her instruments, trusting the artificial horizon, the altitude indicator, the heading reference that kept her oriented when the world offered no clues. The GPS showed her position relative to the valley's entrance, a gap between peaks that funneled weather and aircraft into terrain that had been killing pilots since the Soviets discovered that helicopters burned just as thoroughly as fixed-wing aircraft when hit by weapons designed around patience and elevation. At 6,000 feet, she broke through the bottom of the clouds into a world that looked like it had been carved from wet stone and regret. Visibility was perhaps a quarter mile, rain streaking the canopy in patterns that distorted depth perception. The mountains pressed in from both sides, their slopes invisible above the cloud ceiling, their bases emerging from mist like the walls of a canyon designed to test judgment. She checked her weapons systems, confirming what she already knew. The The GAU-8 was loaded with 1,100 rounds of 30mm ammunition, each shell capable of punching through armor plate. Her hardpoints carried Hydra rocket pods and Maverick missiles, precision weapons for targets that required more than cannon fire. The radio crackled with the operations center frequency. Reaper 6, be advised weather at target area is deteriorating. Ceiling now at 7,500 feet and descending. Recommend you establish holding pattern until conditions improve. Alina checked her fuel gauge, calculating endurance against the tactical reality that 8 Marines didn't have the luxury of waiting for better weather. Every minute she spent in a holding pattern was a minute those men were expending ammunition they couldn't replace, making decisions based on mathematics that ended badly regardless of how well they executed. Negative background. Proceeding to target area. Those Marines don't have time for improved conditions. Silence on the radio. The kind that communicated disagreement filtered through the chain of commands, understanding that pilots made the final call on what they were willing to fly into. When the response came, it was clipped, professional, and edged with the resignation of people who just accepted that the next transmission might be a mayday. Copy that, Reaper. Grid November Quebec 7345. Last transmission indicated heavy contact from elevated positions, multiple directions. No further communication in the past 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Long enough for a firefight to evolve from initial contact into something that required words that didn't exist in tactical doctrine. Long enough for ammunition to become critical, for decisions to shift from aggressive to desperate. Alina descended further, dropping to 4,000 feet above sea level, which put her less than 1,500 feet above the valley floor. At this altitude, the mountains weren't distant geography. They were immediate, present, close enough that she could see individual boulders on their slopes, close enough that a misjudged turn would mean intersection with granite at 250 knots. The terrain rushed past her canopy with the brutal intimacy of low-level flight, every ridge and ravine appearing with the kind of compressed perspective that made distance judgment critical and forgiving of nothing. She activated her targeting pod, the infrared camera swiveling to scan the terrain ahead. Through the display, the world appeared in shades of thermal gray, hot spots showing where sun had touched rocks before the clouds moved in, cold zones marking areas that hadn't seen direct light in hours. She was looking for heat signatures that didn't match the terrain's natural patterns. The specific thermal bloom of human bodies under stress, engines cooling after hard use, anything that suggested combat had reshaped the landscape's thermal geography. The GPS coordinates placed the Marines' last known position in a section of valley where tributaries met, creating a natural choke point that tacticians would recognize and insurgents would exploit. She adjusted her course, feeling the aircraft respond to inputs that had become instinctive. The A-10 flew differently than modern jets, required different thinking, different respect for what the airframe could and couldn't do. The radio came alive with a transmission that made her breath catch. Not background, not command. A voice filtered through static, male, controlled but carrying the edge that came from managing pain and tactical problems simultaneously. Any station, this is Grizzly 16. We are in contact, heavy casualties, ammunition critical. If anyone is listening, we are approximately 400 meters west of last transmission position. We have the transmission cut off, replaced by static and the distinctive percussion of automatic weapons fire close enough to the microphone to cause distortion. Alina keyed her radio immediately, her voice cutting through the static with the kind of authority that came from knowing exactly what those Marines were hearing, what they needed to hear. Grizzly 16, this is Reaper 6, A-10 inbound to your position. I need you to mark your location and identify hostile positions. Can you pop smoke? The pause before the response felt geological, seconds stretching into the kind of duration where doubt could take root. Then the voice returned, and this time she could hear the emotion beneath the professional delivery. Relief, exhaustion, the particular gratitude that came from hearing an aircraft overhead when the alternative was silence. Reaper 6 copy. Purple smoke in 30 seconds. Hostiles are in elevated positions, north and east of our location. Multiple heavy weapons, entrenched positions. We've been taking fire for another burst of static, another percussion of weapons that sounded close enough to make her hands tighten on the stick. Alina descended further, her altitude now reading 2,800 feet above sea level, which put her less than 500 feet above the terrain that was trying very hard to kill the Marines she'd been sent to find. Through the rain and mist, she caught sight of purple smoke, a thin column rising from a cluster of rocks that barely qualified as cover. Around it, the terrain was a tactical nightmare open ground, giving way to ridgelines that provided perfect positions for defenders who'd had time to prepare. She could see muzzle flashes now, bright stars appearing and disappearing on the thermal display as weapons fired from positions that commanded the approaches. The Marines were pinned in a kill box, taking fire from multiple directions with nowhere to maneuver that didn't mean crossing open ground under observation. Grizzly 1-6, I have visual on your smoke. Confirm you are in the rocks approximately 400 meters west of grid November Quebec 7345. Affirm, Reaper. That's us. We have 3 wounded, ammunition down to maybe 200 rounds total. If you can suppress those positions, we can move to better cover approximately 600 meters south. Alina scanned the terrain, her tactical mind converting geography into weapon solutions. The elevated positions were good, well chosen, occupying ground that allowed interlocking fields of fire while providing cover from anything but a direct hit. Taking them out would require precision, would require getting close enough that the margin between effective ordnance delivery and controlled flight into terrain became a matter of seconds and feet rather than minutes and hundreds of yards. Copy that, Grizzly. I'm going to make a gun run on the northern positions first. Keep your heads down and be ready to move when I call it. She didn't wait for acknowledgement, was already banking hard, her hands and feet working the controls to bring the A-10 into an attack profile that would have made safety officers reconsider their career choices. The northern ridge appeared through the mist like a wall, its face pocked with positions that she could see now as darker spots on the thermal display caves, rock overhangs, fighting positions that had been prepared with the kind of care that suggested experience and resources. She armed the GAU-8, feeling the confirmation through the stick as the weapon systems came online. The target pipper on her heads-up display aligned with the ridge, the computer calculating ballistics for altitude, airspeed, target elevation, a dozen variables that would determine whether 30mm shells hit rock or the people behind it. At 1,000 meters, she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 spoke with a sound that defied description, a mechanical roar that vibrated through the entire airframe, a bass note that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. 70 rounds per second, each shell a fist of depleted uranium traveling at speeds that made armor plating academic. The ridgeline erupted in impacts, rock and dirt fountaining into the air as the cannon shells walked across fighting positions with the inexorable precision of mathematics made manifest. She held the trigger for 3 seconds, expended 210 rounds, and then pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces compress her into the seat as the aircraft climbed away from terrain that had been uncomfortably close. Behind her, the northern ridge looked like it had been redesigned by someone with strong opinions about the proper density of stone. Grizzly 1-6, northern positions are suppressed. Starting run on eastern positions. Get ready to move. The Marines didn't waste time on acknowledgement, were already moving, their thermal signatures showing on her display as they bounded across ground that seconds ago would have been certain death. She banked again, this time targeting the eastern positions, her tactical mind nodding that these were further back, better concealed, showing the kind of discipline that suggested professional training rather than enthusiastic amateurs. The targeting pipper settled on a cluster of heat signatures that geometry and experience told her were heavy weapons positions. DSHK or maybe even Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns, weapons that could reach up and touch her if she gave them the angle and the time. She didn't give them either, came in fast and low, the screaming through air thick with moisture and the residue of her previous gun run. The GAU-8 spoke again, its voice the last thing those positions would hear before the world became noise and impact, and the sudden understanding that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. This time she followed the gun run with Hydra rockets, ripple-firing 7-inch projectiles that turned the eastern slope into a demonstration of what happened when high explosives met Earth that wasn't designed to contain them. The rockets impacted in sequence, each explosion triggering sympathetic detonations of ammunition that the defenders had stockpiled with the confidence that comes from controlling terrain. That confidence became irrelevant as their positions turned into thermal blooms bright enough to wash out her infrared display. Grizzly 1-6, eastern positions are neutralized. You have approximately 90 seconds before anyone who wasn't in those positions gets reorganized. Move now. She climbed, gaining altitude to assess the tactical situation, to see if her runs had done more than buy temporary breathing room. Below, the Marines were moving with the controlled urgency of people who understood that speed without awareness was just another way to die. They covered each other's movement, maintained interval, kept weapons oriented toward threats even as they bounded toward terrain that offered something approaching actual cover. Alina scanned for new threats, her eyes moving between the thermal display and the visual picture outside her canopy, looking for the telltale signs that someone down there still thought they had a chance to change the mathematics of this engagement. Movement on a southwestern ridge caught her attention, thermal signatures that resolved into what looked like a Technicolor pickup truck with a heavy weapon mounted in its bed. The vehicle was positioning, its crew apparently deciding that an A-10 making gun runs was a problem that required escalation. She could see them traversing the weapon, could see in the economy of their movements the kind of training that made this more dangerous than it should have been. Grizzly 1-6, you have a technical positioning southwest of your location, approximately 800 meters. They're setting up what looks like anti-aircraft. I'm engaging now. She rolled in, but this time the world tilted in ways that sent alarm bells through her tactical awareness. The technical fired, not at the Marines but at her, tracers reaching up through the mist like lines drawn between their position and her aircraft. The A-10 shuddered as rounds impacted the airframe, the distinctive percussion of heavy caliber hits that she felt through the stick and rudder pedals. Warning lights illuminated on her panel, amber cautions that indicated damage that wasn't immediately critical but wouldn't stay that way if she ignored it. Hydraulic pressure fluctuating in the primary system. Backup systems compensating, but the needles were dancing in ways that meant something significant had been ventilated. She ignored the warnings, focused on the targeting solution, put the pipper on the technical and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 responded, its mechanical voice unchanged by the fact that the aircraft carrying it had just taken damage that would ground anything designed with survivability as a suggestion, rather than a requirement. The technical disappeared into a cloud of impacts, the 30mm shells shredding metal and flesh with the same indiscriminate efficiency. The heavy weapon stopped firing, its crew converted from threat to memory in the space of seconds. But the damage was done. Alina felt it through the controls, a sluggishness that suggested the hydraulic situation was evolving from concerning to critical. The stick felt mushy, required more input to generate the same response. The rudder pedals had developed resistance that spoke of systems working harder to maintain control authority. She keyed the radio, keeping her voice level despite the alarms that were now providing background commentary on her aircraft's degrading condition. Bagram Actual, Reaper 6. I've taken hits, showing hydraulic damage, primary system is degraded. Backup system is holding, but I need to minimize maneuvering. Response came immediately, concern evident even through the professional delivery. Copy, Reaper 6. What's your assessment? Can you make it back to base? Alina scanned her instruments, running calculations that balanced fuel, distance, weather, and the reality that hydraulic systems on the A-10 were redundant until they weren't. The backup system would keep her flying, would get her home, but only if she didn't ask it to do anything that required the kind of maneuvering she'd just been executing. Below, the Marines were still moving, still exposed, still depending on her presence to keep the opposition's heads down long enough to reach terrain that offered actual defensibility. Affirmative, Bagram, I can make it back. But Grizzly still needs cover. I'm staying on station. Silence on the radio, the kind that communicated arguments being had in operations centers, risk assessments being run by people who weren't sitting in a damaged aircraft above terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. When the response came, it was tight, controlled, and carrying the weight of a decision that everyone knew was being made against better judgment. Understood, Reaper 6. You're authorized to remain on station, but we need you to minimize exposure. No more gun runs unless absolutely critical. Alina almost smiled at that, at the idea that there was any other kind of gun run when Marines were counting on you. She descended again, this time more carefully, nursing the controls as she brought the A-10 back into position to provide overwatch. The Marines had reached better cover, had established a defensive position in a cluster of boulders that at least gave them fields of fire and limited the angles of approach. She could see them reorganizing, checking weapons, attending to wounded with the efficient brutality of combat medicine. Grizzly 1-6, Reaper 6, you're in better position now. What's your status? The response came through breathing that suggested pain being managed through willpower and whatever medical supplies they had left. Reaper, we have 3 wounded, 1 critical. We've got maybe 150 rounds and 1 A-4 that might or might not fire. We can hold this position for a while, but we can't move the critical casualty without a litter team and cover we don't have. Alina processed this, her tactical mind converting the situation into geometry and time. A litter team meant personnel exposed, moving slowly, requiring cover that would need to be maintained over distance and duration. The kind of operation that required resources they didn't have and time that was being measured in the wounded Marines' degrading vital signs. Copy that. I'm going to orbit and maintain presence. Anyone who wants to contest this position is going to have to go through me first. She meant it absolutely, and something in her voice must have communicated that, because the Marine on the other end didn't respond with tactical acknowledgement but with something more fundamental. Reaper 6, we see you up there. We see you. Thank you. The words hit harder than the anti-aircraft rounds had, carried weight that metrics couldn't measure. Alina blinked against moisture that had nothing to do with the weather, keyed her radio with hands that were absolutely steady despite everything her body wanted to do. Just doing the job, Grizzly. You sit tight. Help is coming. She climbed to a safer altitude, nursing controls that were becoming progressively less responsive, watching her hydraulic pressure continue its slow migration toward numbers that would eventually require decisions she didn't want to contemplate. The backup system was holding, but holding wasn't the same as healthy, and every minute she stayed on station was a minute closer to the point where choice became academic. The operations center had scrambled a quick reaction force, had helicopters spooling up and infantry loading into aircraft that would make the run once the weather cleared enough to allow it safely. But weather was a variable that answered to meteorology, not urgency, and the clouds showed no signs of lifting. Below her, the Marines waited, maintaining their position with the patience that came from understanding that sometimes survival was just a matter of not making things worse. They'd stopped returning fire, were conserving ammunition, presenting minimal signature while trusting that the A-10 overhead would respond to any threats before they became critical. Alina maintained her orbit, her eyes constantly scanning for movement, for thermal signatures that didn't match the terrain's natural patterns, for any indication that the opposition was regrouping for another attempt. The aircraft felt wrong in her hands now, the controls requiring constant correction, the hydraulic systems working harder to maintain flight that should have been effortless. She checked her fuel, calculated endurance, and came up with numbers that suggested she had maybe 20 minutes before she'd have to leave station regardless of the situation on the ground. 20 minutes before the Marines would be on their own, dependent on their remaining ammunition, and the hope that the opposition had decided one damaged A-10 wasn't worth additional casualties. The radio crackled with a new voice, one she recognized from mission briefings and tactical reviews. Colonel Marks, the Air Operations Commander, his tone suggesting he was about to deliver guidance that wouldn't be received as such. Reaper 6, this is Bagram Actual 6. I'm ordering you to return to base immediately. Your aircraft is damaged, your hydraulic system is degraded, and every minute you stay on station increases the risk of catastrophic failure. Alina's jaw tightened, her hands never leaving the controls as she formulated a response that would acknowledge the chain of command while making absolutely clear that she wasn't leaving 8 Marines to find out what happened when air support departed before ground support arrived. Bagram Actual 6, Reaper 6. I understand the risk assessment. I'm showing adequate hydraulic pressure in backup system, aircraft is controllable, and I have fuel for another 18 minutes on station. Grizzly still has a critical casualty and no means of extraction. I'm staying. The pause that followed carried the weight of a career being evaluated in real time, of a colonel deciding whether to make this a direct order that would require immediate compliance, or to trust the judgment of a pilot who'd been flying combat missions when half his staff were still learning to read approach plates. Reaper 6, I'm aware of the ground situation. I'm also aware that losing you won't help those Marines. I need your honest assessment. Can you make it back to base if you leave now? Alina scanned her instruments again, noted the hydraulic pressure had stabilized at a level that was concerning but not immediately critical, felt the aircraft respond to inputs with enough authority to suggest the backup system was earning its keep. Affirmative, sir. If I leave now, I can make it back. But if I leave now, Grizzly loses their air cover and the next 30 minutes become significantly more complicated for them. Another pause, then a response that suggested Colonel Marks understood exactly what was being said and what wasn't. Understood. You have 15 minutes, then I want you headed home regardless of ground situation. QRF is inbound, ETA 25 minutes. We'll get them out. Copy that, sir. 15 minutes. Alina settled into her orbit, watching the seconds count down on her mission timer, watching the fuel gauge decrease with the reliable certainty of physics, watching the Marines below maintain their position with the kind of discipline that made her throat tight. 14 minutes. 13. The world reduced to the circuit she was flying, the terrain passing below in patterns that became familiar through repetition, the constant scan for threats that would justify the ammunition she was conserving for exactly that moment. At 10 minutes remaining, movement on the northern ridge caught her attention. Thermal signatures, multiple contacts, moving with the coordination that suggested tactical training rather than random civilians who'd wandered into a firefight. She counted 8, 10, 12 figures advancing in bounds, using terrain for concealment, maintaining interval and mutual support. Professional, organized, exactly what the Marines didn't need. Grizzly 1-6, Reaper 6. You have contacts approaching from the north, approximately 12 individuals moving in tactical formation. Range is 800 meters and closing. The Marines' response was immediate, carrying the tension of someone watching their ammunition count and doing math that didn't work out favorably. Copy, Reaper. We see them. We don't have enough rounds to hold them if they press. Alina didn't hesitate, was already rolling in, already accepting that 15 minutes had just become academic, that some decisions weren't made by looking at fuel gauges or hydraulic pressure indicators. The targeting pipper settled on the advancing formation, and she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared, its voice echoing off the valley walls, 30mm shells impacting among the advancing figures with results that were immediate and absolute. Formation broke, those who could still move scattering for cover. Their advance transformed from coordinated to survival in the space of a 3-second burst. She pulled up, felt the controls respond with just slightly more reluctance than before, noted that